Thank you for joining today's training presentation entitled Cultural Proficiency in Drug Court, hosted by Andrew Osborne. This presentation is the second of a three-part series entitled Screening and Assessment. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's web event. We're now looking at the GoToWebinar attendee interface, which is made up of two parts: the view window on the left, which allows you to see everything by Mr. Osborne, and the control panel on the right. Within the control panel is how you can participate in today's event. So let's get started. By clicking the orange arrow located on the control panel, you can open and close the control panel. From the view menu, you can also set the control panel not to auto-hide if you prefer to keep it on all the time. The audio pane provides audio information. Click Audio Setup to select your computer speakers or headset device. During the presentation, you have the ability to send questions to our webinar staff through the question pane. Simply type in your question and click Send. During the presentation, we may ask you to answer a question by raising your hand. This option is located on the Grab tab. And as a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and added to our online video library within 24 hours. The link is stipulated below. I'll now turn you over to Andrew Osborne, who will facilitate this event. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Osborne, and I'm going to be hosting this part 2 of a three-part webinar series entitled Cultural Proficiency in Drug Court. Last week, we gave you some information as to the context of this particular webinar. This webinar is a collaboration between Bureau of Justice Assistance, which we will call BJA, American University, which we shall call AU, and the National Development Research Institutes, and we shall refer to that organization as NDRI. NDRI is a behavioral science research and training organization, and all of us that are within shouting distance of this webinar are in the behavior business. We're working with individuals who are exhibiting risky behavior, however we define it, and what we would like to do is move them down the continuum toward less risky behavior. Well, having said all of that, why do we want to integrate cultural proficiency into the protocols of our drug court team? Well, as far as cultural proficiency goes, we would hope to have higher retention rates by being more culturally proficient. In other words, we're going to lose less people. When do most individuals decide to drop out of the program or split the program or split treatment altogether? It's usually within the first 3 months. So we need to make a connection with them. And by being culturally proficient, we'll make that connection, and outcome will be higher retention rates. As a result of that, of having higher retention rates, we will have higher graduation rates because we'll have more people available to graduate. And thirdly, it will enhance quality assurance. As a result of this new relationship that we have with our participants, we will get feedback from them as to how we can improve the program, because one thing, participants know the program inside out. They know the program from a completely different angle than us professionals. And lastly, as you see there, as a result of being more culturally proficient, we will have lower attrition rates less people will drop out because they basically have not had their cultural toes stepped on and they feel comfortable staying with the program. Well, that's all fine and well, but how are we going to accomplish the whys of cultural proficiency? Well, as you can see from the first bullet, we want to do cultural assessments, but not just on the participants, but also on the providers. I mentioned last week that after the third webinar session next Wednesday, we will post some sample questions that your drug court team can ask of the participants to get a clearer idea of who they are. The more information we have, the more likely it is that we can accomplish behavior change. So we will essentially post that tool on our site. And also, next week is the third in the series of webinars, and we will be discussing provider assessments. You send people to a number of different provider organizations. They may be community-based organizations, they may be mental health programs, they may be substance abuse programs. You would like an assessment done of how culturally proficient are your providers. So again, cultural assessment is a two-headed animal. We're going to be providing you with tools to assess participants' culture and also provider culture. Second bullet, treatment matching. Last week, we launched a poll, and we wanted to know how many of you have essentially 1 to 3 mental health substance abuse providers to choose from, and how many of you have 3 to 6. And from my memory, I believe it was 50-50. So there are choices when you're doing treatment matching. We would like you to essentially match the individual with the program that best suits their needs. And by being culturally proficient, we will attain that goal. Thirdly, incentives and sanctions. Every drug treatment court has incentives and sanctions. What we would like you to be able to do as a result of moving toward cultural proficiency is that your incentives and sanctions will have what I call bite to them. They will have, there's a whole point. And I gave you an example last week of an incentive that was culturally proficient. And I will mention that particular incentive again very shortly. Positive referrals is listed here as the fourth bullet. And with positive referrals, we send people to a number of provider agencies. The last thing we want to do is make a blind referral where we don't know what is waiting for the participant when they get there. The more information that we can give the participant to prepare them for the referral that we are going to be sending them on, the more likely it is that we're going to have a positive referral and that the individual will not return to us disgruntled as a result of the referral not working out. Because just remember, if the referral does not work out, the participant is going to be very reluctant to go on any other referral that you set up for them because they've had a bad experience. Next bullet, alumni feedback. Well, focus groups. This is how we're going to attain enhanced quality assurance. We can conduct focus groups and get information from our alumni, from our participants perhaps who are in the latter phase of the program. They can give us information. We've been very, very successful in conducting and facilitating these focus groups, and you just ask them a question, how can we improve the program? When we first started to facilitate these focus groups, we did not think that the participants would be forthcoming in their suggestions, but to our surprise, we had to cut off the spigot, so to speak, because we were overwhelmed with examples from their side of the fence as to how the program could adjust its protocols ever so slightly to meet their needs. The last bullet that you see there is analyze data. This is where our evaluators come in. We need to have our evaluators at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end so that they can essentially tell us who are we doing a good job with, who are we doing a not so good job with. Why should we continue to refer individuals to that program and 80% of the people that we send there don't work out? We need to know that, and that's what the evaluator can share with us. So these are the 6 ways in terms of how we're going to attain cultural proficiency in our drug court program. Well, if we're going to be talking about culture, we need a definition. In our business, we call it a trainer definition. I'm just going to ask that you rent our definition for the duration of the webinar series. This is essentially important because we all need to be on the same page. Culture is a hot topic. Culture means different things to different people, so that the definition that we are going to move forward with is the one that you're seeing on the screen right now. Culture is the things that people historically have learned to do, believe, value, and enjoy. It is the ideals, beliefs, tools, customs, and institutions into which each member of society is born. And that comes out of an old social work book out of Columbia University, Edgar Goldman. Now, we went through many different definitions of culture before we settled on this one. And just keep in mind, we're not overjoyed with this particular definition. We're not doing backflips because we have problems with this definition. Probably the problem that leaps off the page at you is the last word, born, because people belong to cultures that they are not born into by this definition. Last week, we identified a number of different ways that people may choose to identify culturally. They may choose to identify as LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. They may choose to identify gender-wise, race-wise, ethnicity-wise, age-wise. But you know what? People belong to professional cultures. Those of you who are listening to this webinar, you're a member of a subculture of the criminal justice system. You're a drug court professional. Well, you probation officers out there, talk to probation officers who do not work in drug court. And when you start to explain what you do in drug court, they'll look at you funny. They will essentially look at you and say, well, you mean somebody can come to court and have a dirty urine and you don't kick them out the program or violate them? And you'll say, no, we work with them. And they will fire back at you, what are you running over there, a hug-a-thug program? What's going on over there? That is so alien to other programs in the criminal justice system. So people identify perhaps professionally. They may say, oh, I'm a treatment provider. I'm a therapist. I'm an outreach worker. I'm a peer educator. They may choose to identify accordingly. We also have people who may identify as they're part of a veterans culture. They've been in the military. And those of you who have been in the military know that is a culture unto itself. By our definition, we could go so far as to say there's a culture of poverty. Those individuals who may have been incarcerated previously, we could say there's a prison culture. Ideals, beliefs, tools, customs. We might go so far as to say there's an immigrant culture. There's a gang culture. There's a sports culture. So there are many different cultures, and we're going to examine some of these, and I will give you examples essentially of how these work. Well, when we look at individuals, now we're looking at the participants who are coming into drug court. One of the things that we see constantly is the client's culture shapes his or her belief system about a host of different things. This particular slide is the slide that we left off. We ended at this slide last week, so I want to pick it up from here. First thing that culture shapes the belief about is child rearing. Well, in most cultures, who is responsible for taking care of the kids? Usually it's the women. But that can be extended to the aunts, that can be extended to the grandparents, that can be extended to friends, schoolmates, people in the neighborhood. Well, one particular court used information that they gathered from a cultural proficiency training to develop an incentive that was extremely culturally proficient around child rearing. There was a young lady in one particular drug court. She was a single mom. Her mother was her child care provider. So while we sent her to a number of different referrals, her mom took care of her child. Just remember one thing. What research tells us is that when we have women in our programs, when we provide child care services for them, they do twice as well as the men do. So that's a no-brainer. If you have women in your court, you need to have easy access to child care services. Okay, well, in this particular young lady's case, the court wanted to reward her for moving from phase 1 to phase 2, and they essentially were able to glean a voucher to get her nails done. She was going to get a pedicure and a manicure. But the voucher was not given to the participant in the drug court program. The voucher was given to her mom because the drug court wanted to send a message: we appreciate what you're doing, we respect what you're doing, and we'd like you to continue in that role. Because if mom essentially backed out of being the child care provider, that young lady has to drop out of drug court. So child rearing is something that culture shapes the belief system about. How about sexual roles? Some drug courts have a graduation requirement that individuals either get a GED or they get a job. However, some young ladies may belong to a culture where they do not value women working. We may want that young lady to move forward and gain employment, but she's not getting any support at home. She's not going to get an individual to be her child care provider so she can go to work, because in her culture, women should stay at home, or women should be barefoot and pregnant. So we move on to disclosure. Culture shapes an individual's belief system about who they can disclose information to. We had a situation where a young man, a Latino from Oregon, came up to us after a presentation and said, now I know what happened, because in Oregon, we developed a new risk assessment instrument. And a year later, we looked up and realized that we had lost 53% of our Latino population. The question then came up, was there something in the risk assessment instrument that was producing this anomaly? There was one question. Do you have family members in the community? Now, that's a very good question from a probation point of view. You want to know, is the person tied to the community? Do they have family in the community, children in the community, relatives in the community? That would reduce the likelihood that they would run away. In this particular case, when these young men were asked, do you have family members in the community, they answered no. Fortunately, Oregon had probation officers who knew these men and said, listen, I know that Juan has family in the community because he lives with his aunt and uncle, and I was just at his house last week. When we followed up and asked them, why did you answer no? What was the answer? They did not want to cast any light on their undocumented family members. So as far as disclosure is concerned, the message is do not share information outside of the family. It's all about protecting the family. Okay, so you see where these young men decided it would be better if I got incarcerated than if I shared the information with people outside the group. So disclosure is impacted by culture. Adult caretaking. Now, by adult caretaking, what we mean is who takes care of the seniors in the family or in the community. And what we know is that in Western culture, it's okay to send your parent to a nursing home. However, in other cultures, it's forbidden. The parent dies in the home, and that's how it has been for generations. That's how it's going to continue to be. Many of the participants that you have in drug court right now may be the designated adult caretaker. However, we don't know that because we don't ask that question. I had a young man as a participant in my program who was the designated caretaker. His Aunt Doris required dialysis 3 times a week. She was in a wheelchair. He had to take her on public transportation and get there at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he did it religiously, never missed a beat. When I heard this in group, I was very upset because Willie would always give me excuses as to why he could not essentially make the appointments that I had set up for him. And I had to just tell him, listen, Willie, if you can get Aunt Doris to dialysis in a wheelchair on public transportation at 6 o'clock in the morning, 3 times a week, you can make the referrals that I set up for you, which are around the corner from your home. Again, I only knew Willie in a very narrow track. He was the young man who missed appointments and gave me hot urines. That's all I knew. Again, if I had asked more in-depth questions, I would have known this particular piece of information. Treatment. Treatment to you may be a whole different concept than treatment of the participant. And I'm going to have to make some comments now about AA. We love AA to death in drug court. Why? It's free, and it occupies participants' time, and it is a positive experience. However, years ago, I worked for an organization that had donated the basement to the Harlem AA group since its inception. They met every Wednesday night. Every Thursday morning, the deacon of the church that was housing the AA meeting would be waiting for me at my door and saying, Osborne, you have to see what those people did to the basement. I thought they had put their cigarettes on the floor. I didn't know what we were going to find. The deacon led me to the garbage cans. What was in the garbage cans? Liquor bottles with liquor in them. And he says, look, this is supposed to be AA and they're drinking. I said, listen, I don't know what's going on. I'll track down the young man that runs the meetings. I'll get back to you. Took me about 2 weeks. I finally tracked him down. I said, listen, I'm having problems with the church folk. They're finding liquor in the liquor bottles in the garbage. What can I tell them? He looked at me like I was crazy. Why? He said, you have to understand our motto here at Harlem AA. I said, your motto? What's your motto? What did he say? Fake it till you make it. Now, I had to think about that for a long time. In the end, I liked it. I liked it conditionally because what they're saying, I'm going to paraphrase what they're saying. What they were saying was that even if you're still drinking, come to the meetings because you can't get better not coming to the meetings. But we have one rule. You have to leave your liquor at the door. So it was a good sign that there was liquor in the bottles. It showed that they just didn't swig it down before they went through the door and essentially started in with the meeting. Now, that's a great meeting to send someone to who's not in treatment. They're still using. We have to start somewhere. It's a harm reduction model. However, that's the last meeting you should send someone to who is in a drug court program or who is in drug treatment. They don't need to be sitting next to someone with liquor on their breath. So I know we love AA, but just remember, all AA is not alike. There are AA meetings that would never tolerate this behavior because they're set up differently. But what we see happening very often in drug court, we will give individuals a list of AA meetings and say, you are responsible for attending a meeting, listening to the message, and getting a sponsor. But we don't know what meeting they're going to. They may be going to exactly the wrong meeting for their particular circumstance and their particular place in recovery. Okay, how about nutrition and diet? Well, we're talking about food now. Well, food is culture. Every culture has its own specialty dish. The only thing that I would mention or advise you drug court professionals out there is there's something about food, it reduces resistance. If you have a potpourri lunch where you ask people to bring in a dish for lunch from their culture, people talk very freely about how the dish is prepared, when it's prepared, who prepares it, what holiday is it a religious holiday? You can share a lot of information over food. So just keep in mind that food is culture. Well, we've got nonverbal behavior in the top of the second column there. Many of our folks come from cultures that value nonverbal behavior. Now, that runs against what we do in treatment. We want people to become engaged in group, participate in group. But we may have individuals in the group who come from a culture where it's not cherished. Nonverbal behavior is held in high esteem. So we don't want to misread nonverbal behavior as being resistant or as being unmotivated. We want to be able to read the signs accurately. Okay, healing. In Western culture, we assign certain professionals to the job of healing. We have nurses, nurses' aides, physicians' assistants, nurse practitioners, doctors. We have all sorts of specialists. But in some cultures, healing may be assigned to a family member who may be an herbologist, who may be the designated person that they go to for a particular ailment. And this healthcare is a major issue in this country. Many people do not have healthcare, and they are very likely to go back to their cultural, to having their needs met culturally through cultural healing. Learning styles. We put a great emphasis in Western culture on the written word. We give people papers to read. We give them a list of assignments. We contract with them. Well, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. You signed the contract. Unbeknownst to us very often is that while we are attempting to communicate them through the written word, they may be functionally illiterate. And one thing you have to keep your eye on, our participants and our clients in treatment are experts at fooling people into believing that they can read when they can't read. You will hand them a piece of paper. They will look at it up and down, top to bottom, but they cannot read it. You need to ensure that the individual is able to comprehend what's on the written page. And you may have to make adjustments because many of our folks are just not capable of reading certain documents. Discipline is also something that is shaped by culture. And the closer individuals are to their native culture, the harsher the discipline. Those of you who may be from immigrant families know that your parents' and grandparents' form of discipline was much harsher than yours. Okay? So again, discipline is something that we may have to work with our participants on. Punctuality. If you have not been attending school, you have not been working, punctuality is a problem. People just don't seem to be able to get places on time. It's a skill that you have to practice. And we don't have a lot of time right now, but I will just suffice it to say that all of us who are listening to this webinar right now, we're westernized. We believe in being on time. Some of us get there early because we want to be on time, but many of our participants, when they first get to us in drug court, they believe in being in time. It's not a matter of being on time, it's in time. They got there. That's why, and again, they're looking at you like, well, what's the problem? I was there. I may have been late, but I was there. So punctuality is something that is shaped by culture. And the last thing in that second column, music and art. Music and art are culturally shaped. Those of you who are working with young people know that your taste in music is very different from their taste in music. And this is something that many of us need a consultant to basically guide us through to be able to tell us what's going on with the music. And you have a consultant. Those of you who have kids, you have a consultant right now. I had to make an arrangement with my son. When we ride around in the car, what would normally happen? I would put on my music, and he would put on his earphones, and there would be a complete disconnect. Had to make a deal with him. I said, listen, when we ride around in the car, we play your music. That way, I can ask him questions about what are they saying? What does that mean? That's how I could get an education in the music of an 18 to 25-year-old when I'm over 50. Okay? So again, it's going to be different, and we may need to brush up on our music and art to be able to appreciate what's going on there. Okay, let's get to this second slide of how culture shapes the belief system. It also shapes the belief system about drug and alcohol. Some people belong to cultures where being able to hold your liquor is something that is cherished. You need to understand that. Have you ever done an intake on a young man or a young woman who puts away 2 6-packs of beer a day and never thinks of mentioning it to you when you're essentially doing the intake on that individual? So again, we need to examine what's your relationship, what's your culture's relationship with drugs and alcohol. How about homosexuality? Well, let's face it, here in the West, we're a little homophobic. And this can be problematic in drug court when we send individuals to service providers. One young man in Boston came to us and said, I realized what happened. I said, well, what happened? He says, every time I send an outwardly gay client to the Salvation Army, they crap out of the program. They split the program. I said, well, that may be because the Salvation Army does not cherish homosexuals. They don't treat homosexuals. They don't welcome them. Perhaps they're uncomfortable working with that population. This is a treatment matching issue. You just need to know who you're sending where. We talked about employment. If your participant is a woman, she may belong to a culture that does not cherish women working. And what that's going to mean, she's not going to get much support in essentially going to work and having her needs taken care of. Friendship. Friendship means different things depending upon what culture the individual comes from. I'll give you an example. What does friendship mean in a gang culture? Well, what does culture mean in a prison culture? What does friendship mean in a gay culture? Things are different. So friendship gets redefined depending upon what culture the individual identifies with. And just remember, they choose what culture they basically identify with. We don't. So that's essentially what we call client-centered. How about importance of family authority figures? Many cultures revere elders. And we've had situations where I used to run the day treatment program for the New York City Department of Probation that pretty much parallels drug court. And what would happen? They called me from central office. They said, we have a Japanese probation officer, Mr. Yamamoto. We'd like you to give him a tour of the facility. I said, okay, send him up. He shows up, all 4 feet 11 of him. He comes into my office. I look at him and I say, Mr. Yamamoto, you're not a probation officer, are you? You're a judge, right? He says, no, I'm a probation officer, and in Japan, over half the probation officers are senior citizens. I said, well, how does that work? He says, well, many people retire from one job, Then they take another job working in probation because in their culture, elders are revered. So when the elder is out making a home visit, everybody is there at attention, shoes shined, hair combed, pants pressed. Why? The elder is in the home. Now, many of you are working with individuals who are from cultures that also hold elders in high esteem. They can be very instrumental in seeing that that participant gets through the program. They are essentially what I will call the junior PO. They can be they're going to be with the individual much longer than we are. So we need to work with those individuals. In Brooklyn Treatment Court, there's a young lady, Margie, who works outside the courtroom to see who is coming to court for who. She makes contact with the elders who may be there, sharing with them what she can provide, and basically reinforcing to the elders that we want your relative to successfully complete the program. And she gets much cooperation from these elders, and this is a resource that many of us are not using enough. We need to use family members, elders, and integrate them into what we do with our programs. Medications. Healthcare is an issue. Many people are using traditional meds because they don't have healthcare. And if an individual, as has happened to me, I had a young man, Lee. He was an Asian young man, and I wanted to refer him for mental health services. Now, Paul Warren just conducted a session on co-occurring disorders. So you're going to be discussing mental health issues. And in my particular case, I wanted to refer this young man to mental health services, and he resisted. Every time I would set up an appointment, he had an excuse as to why he could not make it. So I finally cornered him. I said, Lee, listen, why don't you want to go to the mental health referral I'm setting up for you? And his answer was as plain as day. He says, you practice Western medicine, you cut us and drug us. It's surgery or chemotherapy, and I don't want to do that. I'd rather go to my Aunt Shirley for the specialty for depression. Now, in that circumstance, I had to allow him to play that out. I said, go to Aunt Shirley, get the specialty, but if that does not work out, come back to me. I've got plan B. You can't just uniformly say, no, you can't have the traditional medication because you're not validating their culture, and in all likelihood, the person's going to leave the program because you've stepped on some cultural toes. How about marriage? Second column, top. Well, with marriage, many of our individuals in drug court may come from a culture or come from a part of the world where they had an arranged marriage. Then they come here, they may get married again. We very often would like to know about their resources, the money that they essentially have. And we say, well, where's all that money going? Are they buying drugs? What are they doing with the money? Very often, what they're doing with the money is sending money home to the first wife, to the children that may be back home. So that is something that pops up, particularly if you have immigrant participants. Okay, learning styles. Some people don't respond to the written word. They respond better to verbal prompts, visual prompts, or they do extremely well in group or they do terrible in group. It all depends on what their culture dictates. Death and dying. How people observe loss is very different. Young man came to me and said, Osborne, I can't make that appointment that you set up for me because I have to go with my mom and my dad to visit my grandmother. I said, okay, when you return from that trip, come back to me and I'll reschedule your appointment. Well, what did I find out? I found out that his grandmother was dead. So I made the assumption. I said, listen, when he gets back here, we're going to sanction him to death. He just doesn't want to go to the appointment that I was setting up for him, so we're going to have to take some action. What did I find out? Twice a year, he and his mother and father would drive upstate New York, plant flowers at Grandma's grave, sit down, and have a conversation with the elders. That's how they observe loss. I felt very bad because I completely misread the situation. So I don't want you to misread the situation. Ask questions. Language. Language is culture. Now, although, and definitely when people speak another language, that's their language, that's their culture, and they are essentially protecting it. The language helps protect and insulate the culture. Well, we have some people that we're working with in drug court who speak English, or at least so they allege they do. They say that they speak English, but they're speaking another English that perhaps we're not familiar with because we're older. We're coming from another generation altogether. Well, if that's the case, participants love speaking in front of you to their homies, so to speak, knowing that you don't have a clue about what they're talking about. Okay, that's language. How about domestic violence? We have many people who come from cultures where women and children are considered property. A man can do whatever he wants to do with them. We may need to educate some of our participants if they do come from cultures where domestic violence is looked at favorably in some cases. How about hospitality? How about bringing people into your home? Well, what do our probation officers have to do? They have to make home visits. Now, an individual may belong to a culture where they are extremely uncomfortable with a man being alone in their house with either their wife or daughter. So we may have to be sensitive to those issues around hospitality, because if not, we'll step on cultural toes and that individual will essentially leave the program. And the last thing you see there is the criminal justice system. Ask some cultural participants or some individuals, what is your take on the criminal justice system, and it'll be negative. Ask African Americans about the criminal justice system, and they may not say something favorable. Ask Native Americans about the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They may not have anything favorable to say. Ask new immigrants about the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Again, what might they say? It breaks up families. It's destroying culture. They may say something negative. So these last two slides were to give you a flavor for how culture shapes belief systems. Well, one thing that we know is that different cultures, various cultures, diverse cultures come together in drug court. On the left-hand side of this slide, what you can see is our skeleton definition of culture. It's the ideals, beliefs, tools, customs, and institutions into which a person is born, but we already tackled that problem about born. On the right-hand side, you see the cultures that essentially collide in drug court. Well, you've got the culture of drug abuse and addiction. When an individual first comes to drug court, are they saying they want to stop using drugs? No. Basically what they're saying is, how can I reduce the consequences of my use? I got into a bad spot right now. Everybody's doing it. Why are they picking on me? I don't know. I just want to get back into the neighborhood, get back to the block so I can continue to do what I was doing. So that very often is the culture of the new participant who's going to be coming into your court. Then we have the culture of drug treatment. And just remember, drug treatment is not unified. Drug treatment is not monolithic. We have many different modalities of treatment. We have residential, we have outpatient, we have TC, therapeutic community, we have intensive outpatient, we have chemotherapy, we have methadone. So drug treatment will not necessarily agree. All drug treatment providers believe that their modality of treatment is the best way. The trick for you is to make the best possible match. So in order to do that, you need information about the participant as well as information about that provider or that drug treatment program. Next you see CBOs. That stands for community-based organizations. Many individuals are referred to these CBOs either for housing assistance, for a job, or for a meal. So again, our CBOs need to be assessed so that we match up the participant with the CBO that can best meet their needs. And the last bullet that you see there is drug court. Drug court has its own culture. It has the culture of the court. And essentially what has to happen here, we love people to go through our phases. We would like individuals to move through together, but that never happens. People move at a different pace because everybody's different. We're working with individuals who are, in some cases, starting the race of life 10 yards behind the starting line, or in some cases 10 yards ahead. So some people are going to move through quickly, others not so quickly. So as I say, and I said this last week, drug court is a shotgun wedding. We are bringing together professional cultures and the cultures of the participants that have traditionally been adversarial. Now we need them to work together in order to affect that essential behavior change. So we have collisions in drug court that we're going to have to navigate around. And the more culturally proficient we are, the more likely it is that we will be able to do that. At this point in time, I'd like to launch a poll. Now, I'm going to put up a very short paragraph. Very short paragraph. And what I would like you to do out there in the audience, I'd like you to count the F's in the paragraph. F's like Frank or Fred. And I'm going to give you 5 seconds to count the F's. Now, this is a very short paragraph. So I'm going to ask you to count. I'm going to put it up for 5 seconds, and here you go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, I'm going to close the poll, and I'm going to ask Diana to close the poll. Okay, and is it possible, Diana, for you to share the poll with the audience? I have one person who's responded. I'll give you another 10 seconds here. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now, I'm not going to, I can go back. Now, what usually happens when we do this, I will ask people, how many individuals counted 3 F's? How many counted 4? How many 5 got 5, and how many had 6? The correct answer to the question is there are 6 F's in the paragraph. Most individuals count 3 because I set you up in the exercise. I mentioned count the F's like Frank or Fred. And what that does, it puts in your mind, oh, I'm looking for an F at the beginning of a word. I'm looking for an F that sounds like an F. When most of the F's that are missed are the F's in of, because it's at the end of a word and it sounds like a V. Now, What happens on the job is very much similar to what happened in that exercise. We have cues. I gave you the cue. Count the F's like Frank or Fred. What's the cue that you get on the job? You get the folder very often before you see the individual or before you encounter the individual. What happens then? You put that through your own personal and professional filters. You say, oh, he was charged with this. He's been arrested 3 or 4 times. And you start to develop a picture as you pass this information through your filters. And then you develop a perception of who is going to be standing in front of you. You then make an assumption about that individual. And then lastly, you behave accordingly. Now, that may not be necessarily correct because you did a lot of this before you encountered the individual personally. Now, we said last week we want to sharpen your observation skills. And by sharpening your skills, I'd like you to look at this particular picture, which comes off of the front page of the Village Voice magazine in New York after the Amadou Diallo shooting. There's an unfortunate incident where a young immigrant was essentially shot by the police. And in the Amadou Diallo case, what happened was that the Village Voice conducted what we call an unscientific poll, basically asking undercover police officers, why do you stop young black men? This is a big problem in many of our urban areas. Well, what you see there is a graphic illustration that basically categorizes their responses. 20% of stops were attributed to the individual wearing a hooded sweat top. 30% or 10% of stops were attributed to baggy trousers. If they were wearing high-top sneakers that were unlaced, that accounted for 10% of stops. Exposed boxer shorts. The fashion police should stop these people. 10% of stops were attributed to that. And bandanas. Now, bandanas could be gang-related, okay? And we had 20% of stops have been attributed to the bandana. Now, understand there's a big difference between undercover police officers and drug court practitioners. Undercover police officers have seconds to make a determination, is this a dangerous situation or not? You folks have the advantage of time if you're working in drug court because you see people over time. And we would love for you to essentially enhance your observation skills so you know exactly what you're looking at, so you read the signs accurately. My problem with this particular visual is that on a rainy day in Brooklyn at 6 o'clock in the morning, when I'm out walking my dog, I may look like that. And the police do roll up on me, but I have 2 things that perhaps a young person doesn't have. I have gray hair and I have a big mouth. Okay, so once the officers see the gray hair and once I say to them, good morning, officer, say hi to Captain O'Hara for me back at the precinct and tell him I'll see him at the community planning board meeting on Thursday, they take off. Okay, they're not looking for me, they're looking for somebody else. But we do not want to misread the signs and just make a snap judgment. That's a problem. Just can't do that. How about this next slide? This is taken from the New York Times Sunday edition. They did a whole expose about talking about race. And when I look at this particular visual, what I see is that you see 2 young men, 1 black, 1 white. I was home one Saturday vacuuming. Okay, sounds real sexy, right? Vacuuming. I have my back turned to the television, and the announcer, it's a sporting event, it's halftime, the announcer is interviewing Jason Williams, who used to play in the NBA as of last year. Now, Jason Williams is white, and he went to school, to high school, with his best friend, Randy Moss, and we all know Randy Moss, wide receiver in the NFL. Now, the announcer is interviewing Jason Williams. My back is turned to the television. I swear up and down that the announcer is interviewing a black kid, because Jason Williams speaks, again, like you might suppose a black kid would speak. He comes through the sports genre. He comes through the sports culture. He speaks like the other basketball players that are around him. I started to think, what would happen in drug court if a young man who was white came into drug court and started to talk like a black young man talks? Would that make a positive impression on the judge, or would it make a negative impression on the judge? I don't want an answer. Think that one over. Okay. This slide, and we've got about 4 minutes left, this slide was developed by Darrell Turpin, who was the director of the Jefferson County Drug Court in Louisville, Kentucky. The judge there was Judge Henry Weber. And what Darrell observed was that young African-American men would come in exhibiting the behavior that you see in the left-hand column. And what Darrell essentially did was compare that to the perception of court staff. So you see in the left-hand column under behavior, sloppy dress. They would come in dressed very sloppily. What's the perception of the drug court staff? They're being disrespectful. That's why they dress like that. Okay? In the left, we have questioning actions. They're always asking questions. What's the perception of the court staff? There's a lot of distrust. There's a healthy paranoia, and we just want them to ask questions because we want to help them right now. There's a refusal to look in the eyes. That is picked up as being hostile. We want, those of us in the criminal justice system, we want people to look us in the eye when we ask them a question. So we may be picking up these signals, but we may be misreading them. And lastly, what do we have here? What behavior is exhibited by these young black men? Well, they're tardy. They don't show up. They're incomplete task assignments. What's the perception? They're being resistant. There's a lack of commitment, when in fact it may be something else altogether. It may not be that negative. Next, nonverbal. They don't say much. What's the perception of court staff? There's a refusal to develop rapport. And one thing I'll say about all young men, I don't care if they're white, black, what have you, most young men are nonverbal. You ask them, hey, how you doing today? They have two answers. I'm okay or I'm stressed. Ask a woman or a young lady how she feels today. Get a chair. She has a lot of different shade on how she feels that day, and it depends on a number of different things. And lastly, you see there, what's the behavior of these young men? They tell a lot of war stories. What's the perception of court staff? That's a defeatist attitude. We're trying to get them to go in another direction, when in fact the war stories may be something that they have to just to survive in the neighborhood where they live. So we just want to be able to read the signs very, very accurately. I would like that we've now come to, that's the last slide, and I have a reminder here from Clyde Frederick that you have questions to be filled out at the end of the session. So I just would like to remind you that, number one, the third in the series of this webinar will be next week, April 13th, 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And I'd like to remind you folks out there to complete the survey. That's how you're going to get a certificate. And that's your incentive. So we will see you next week, same time, same station, Wednesday, 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Be careful out there. Bye-bye.